Norges Bank Investment Management found that since 2012, risk-based divestments from portfolio companies deemed to have insufficient risk management of human rights and climate-related issues have increased.
A lot of those WROs were placed because the products were linked to forced labor. Now, I imagine for American companies who have been importing these products, especially those that are publicly listed, this means significant costs. Hi everyone, this is Alexandra Lasota in the next episode of the Sustainability Brief. Today I have with me Joanne Bauer, who is going to talk about integrating human rights into the ISSB standard. So tune in. I was wondering where to even start introducing you given the 3 decades of all of your achievements. Please tell me that there was a point when you were a humble intern, didn't know what to do with your life. How did it all start?
Oh, thanks so much. So I'm going to start with my earliest involvement in the business and human rights movement, which really goes back to the 1990s when human rights advocates began agitating for international business and human rights rules, realizing that purely voluntary initiatives were not doing the job. They weren't stemming the rising tide of adverse human rights corporate impacts. At the time, I was Director of Studies at the Carnegie Council for Ethics and International Affairs. I led our human rights program and founded the publication Human Rights Dialogue, which had a number of issues that were focused on human rights at work. I had a regional focus on Asia, having lived and studied in the region for several years. And as an outgrowth of initiatives I was directing, I had just published a book with Cambridge University Press called The East Asian Challenge for Human Rights. And I had a new book project in the works on forging environmentalism, which was a bottom-up fieldwork-based 4-country study of the social and cultural values that people bring to bear on environmental problems and how they mobilize those values to create and sustain programs and movements of environmental action in their communities. So I've always had a twin interest in both human rights issues and environmental issues. But going back to my background, so in 2005, UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, under a Human Rights Commission mandate, appointed UN Special Representative of the Secretary General, John Ruggie, to that role. And his mandate was to develop a framework that clarified the responsibilities of companies in relation to the human rights impacts of their policies and operations. And that was the Protect, Respect, Remedy framework, which then formed the basis of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, which is the authoritative standard that was endorsed by the Human Rights Council in 2011. My having spent the prior decade working on human rights, I was drawn to the initiative, which to me was exciting for being a whole new area of human rights rulemaking and a departure from the past, where you now have a focus on companies rather than states as the duty bearers who owe that duty of care to the rights holder. So I left the Carnegie Council and shortly thereafter met Chris Avery, who had just created a new nonprofit startup called the Business and Human Rights Resource Center. The Resource Center was the main organization at the time focused on business and human rights. And in fact, it played an instrumental role in creating the field and continues to be what I call the epicenter of the business and human rights field. So Chris hired me to be their New York representative. That's where I was based at the time. I'm still in New York. So a couple of years later, in 2008, I was asked to teach a course on business and human rights at Columbia University, where I've been teaching since. And then I left the Resource Center in 2011 and took a position building out a business in Columbia's Institute for the Study of Human Rights. And then in 2008, with 2 partners, Ed Rikosh and Paul Rissman, I co-founded Rights Collab, a nonprofit organization which is dedicated to developing outside-of-the-box solutions to systemic problems. So we each, Paul, Ed, and I each came to this endeavor with different big ideas. And I need to credit Paul with having his eye on, from the very beginning, the Sustainability Accounting Standards Board, or SASB, which had just released that year its first set of standards. And at the time, ISSB was very U.S. focused. In fact, it was developed to meet the needs of U.S.-based investors who had operated under a particular legal notion of fiduciary duty, still operate under this notion of fiduciary duty that requires investors to pay strict attention to financial materiality. So with respect to non-financial issues, investors can only consider those issues that are financially material. But it's the investors themselves under the law, the reasonable investor, that determines financial materiality. And this position on fiduciary duty and financial materiality was affirmed and reaffirmed by U.S. court decisions. But that leaves open the question of who is the responsible investor and who could make such a determination. It's clearly not most financial analysts. This isn't their training, and they don't know which sustainability issues are financially material. So ISSB was born as a nonprofit initiative with the backing of the largest institutional investors to carry out the research and define financially material sustainability issues for investors. So this means that for whatever issues the ISSB Standards Board defined as financially material, investors not only could have the assurance that they could take those sustainability issues into account in their investment decisions, but in effect, they would be legally required to do so. So we wanted to leverage ISSB by better integrating human rights into the standards, recognizing, for example, if you can get freedom of association and collective bargaining into the ISSB standards, that could be a really big win for workers.
And just to go back to IFRS and ISSB, because I imagine that some of our listeners may not have the background, I think so. ISSB, the International Sustainability Standard Board, is an international board of experts within the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, right? And so one of the aim that they have is to set a universal standard for the way that publicly listed companies report on their sustainability-related actions, so that all businesses can be assessed using the same criteria and framework. And this essentially is expected to lead to better informed decisions of investors on where to put their money.
And I think also important to note, the ISSB is backed by the International Organization of Securities Commissions, so it has quite a lot of power in that sense. The mission is to create a comprehensive global baseline of sustainability-related financial disclosures, which can then be adopted by regulators across jurisdictions. It's the twin to the EU's Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, requires due diligence. The Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive requires reporting on that due diligence. The significance of the ISSB is, again, that it is a global baseline that takes us beyond the EU.
I would report that we are going to discuss today a roadmap for integrating human rights into ISSB standards. You mentioned that 2/3 of the ISSB own investor advisory group members. So this is a group together managing about $74 trillion US dollars, already have human rights policies aligned with the UN guiding principles and the OECD guidelines, which indicates that they are also interested in human rights due diligence. And so as part of the report, you have been looking to what extent the due diligence guidance are already present in the ISSB standard. So what did you find there?
Yes. In June 2023, the ISSB put out two standards, IFRS S1 on general requirements for sustainability disclosures and IFRS S2 on climate-related disclosures. And I think it's fair to say that human rights due diligence was not actively contemplated at the time of creating those standards. Yet there is strong evidence, as you suggested, that human rights due diligence is financially material and should be part of the standard. So just starting on that point, human rights due diligence is a risk management system. So it's inherently about having the policies and processes in place to be able to identify and address actual and potential impacts that can manifest as risks. So there may be questions about whether the impacts do translate into material financial risk. But not having a system, a risk management system in place to detect those risks in the first place is problematic and inherently risky. In other words, I think we can sort of with some confidence say that it's financially material. And investors see this too. The ISSB conducted its own interviews with investors globally as part of its human capital project. And they heard resounding support for human rights due diligence disclosures. A couple of individual examples just in recent months that we cited in the report is that the investor advisory group member and big major investor, Norges Bank Investment Management, did a study and found that since 2012, risk-based divestments from portfolio companies deemed to have insufficient risk management of human rights and climate-related issues have increased the cumulative return on equity management by 0.16 percentage points. So that's the equivalent of $150 million on a $1 trillion portfolio. And they've also found that State Street Global Advisors also recently published its expectation for companies to carry out human rights due diligence as part of its 2025 Sustainability Stewardship Service proxy voting and engagement policy. So there is a strong case for human rights due diligence to be in scope of the ISSB's mission. And what we benchmarked is those S1 general requirements and a selection of the SASB standards. So the SASB standards are industry-specific standards for 77 industries, and they serve as a reference point for reporting entities to conduct their materiality assessments as required by S1. And the selection that we chose was the 7 industry standards of the consumer goods sector, because we reason these industries have complex supply chains and would be a place where you would expect to find or might expect to find human rights due diligence disclosure metrics. What we found is that the standards in their current form only offer partial support for investors that are seeking this information, which on the upside means that companies reporting under these standards may already be providing some visibility into their HRDD, as we call it, human rights due diligence processes. And even though the ISSB didn't explicitly design S1 or the SASB standards with human rights due diligence in mind, our analysis of S1 reveals that human rights due diligence is not incompatible with financially material disclosure standards. So, for example, within S1, human rights impacts are acknowledged as potentially financially material risks in the conceptual foundations and the application guidance. Companies are encouraged to consider risks that may emerge in the short, medium, and long term, even potentially those that may not be likely if they are severe enough.
I am surprised that the incorporation of HRDD has not happened before and that there is not more discussion about that, because I am thinking about all of the withhold release orders that have been placed on a lot of products that have been, of course, imported into the US. And so a lot of those WROs were placed because the products were linked to forced labor. Now, I imagine for American companies who have been importing these products, especially those that are publicly listed, this means significant costs, and that of course can have tangible implications on the market value, which would be of relevance to the investors.
On your point about withhold release orders, that is one of the strongest cases, I think, as you pointed out, for the financial materiality of forced labor and modern slavery. And for those of us who have been trying too hard to get human rights considerations into standards like this, one of the challenges of making the case for the financial materiality is if you're only measuring or looking at the potential impact on the firm itself in the short term. If we can extend it that timeline to medium and longer term, then we believe that you can see adverse impacts impacting companies. And this is contemplated very clearly in S1. It's also, I mentioned the conceptual foundations and application guidance. It's also well reflected in the core content. Most OECD guidance due diligence steps are addressed in S1, except for step 6 on remediating adverse impacts, and that's entirely absent. Step 3, which is the cease, prevent, mitigate adverse impacts, is partially addressed in the S1's sections on governance and strategies. It's missing from risk management, which is precisely where one would expect to see it. We also don't see a reference to a human rights policy or the need for a saliency assessment. These are core pieces of human rights impacts that help you to identify the most severe impacts, those most likely to become business risks. And so as a result, we're seeing incomplete coverage of human rights due diligence in S1. But we do think these issues can be addressed relatively easily by specifying disclosures on all due diligence steps. And that is really key, because without comprehensive due diligence, corporate management really can't reliably identify which impacts may evolve into material company level risks. And that makes effective reporting on material risks really challenging. So we believe that making sure that all due diligence steps are part of the disclosure framework will really go a long way in helping to reconcile the tension between different disclosure frameworks that emphasize impact materiality and S1's focus on financial materiality, which will also then help to align the ISSB standards with the expectations of asset managers, asset owners. One thing I'd like to point out, and this is an important finding, is that when we benchmarked the OECD due diligence steps against the consumer goods sector standard, where there are 58 metrics across those 7 industries, we found that 57 out of the 58 metrics in those standards request information on impacts. And of those 57, 29 do not have what we called a financial materiality threshold, by which I mean they don't say in either the technical protocol or the metrics itself, tell us about your impacts only if they have an effect on your bottom line. And for those that did have a financial materiality threshold, it's often not a central part of the metric. There would be a long explanation in the technical protocol, and maybe only after points A, B, C, D, and E will they say something to the effect of, and how this has affected your financial accounts or how it has affected your ability to attract talent and so on and so forth. So that would be what we would call a financial materiality threshold. In other words, the standards are already largely written, not fully, but largely written as impact standards. And I think that's important to understand, especially as we think about how we get interoperability across frameworks that have avowedly different purposes. So I had mentioned earlier the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive with its double materiality approach, and the Global Reporting Initiative, GRI, with its impact materiality approach. There may be, and we believe that through integrating HRDD, there will be greater opportunity for interoperability by recognizing and building out what is already has a strong foundation for human rights due diligence disclosure within the ISSB standards.
I have to say that the word interoperability is the hot topic of every sustainability conference that I have joined this year. So I think there is a lot to say to that. Now, a question that jumps at me. So to what extent, or what are the chances for the standard to be aligned with those HRDD concepts, and what the process would look like?
Right. So the way materiality, let me just say this, the way materiality is framed does present a challenge for more fully integrating human rights due diligence into the ISSB standards, and that needs to be acknowledged and addressed. Human rights due diligence is an impact management process. Companies are expected to conduct comprehensive assessments of their actual and potential human rights impacts, and then meaningfully engage stakeholders as part of that process, and then prioritize actions based on those findings. And in contrast, you've got S1 that refers companies to the SASB standards, which are, as I described earlier, predetermined or finance-focused approach to identify material sustainability topics. So that approach can be at odds with the more broader and more dynamic due diligence approach required by human rights due diligence. But while the SASB standards, as I already said, can produce reporting on impacts, the problem from a human rights due diligence perspective is that it's likely not to capture all of the impacts, since that's something that each company should do for itself. And I should hasten to add that the S1 does require, they don't require they require referring to the SASB standards, but they don't require strict reporting to the SASB standards. It's up to the individual entity to determine whether those SASB standards apply for their industry apply. But there's an expectation that that they are likely to apply, and if they don't, then the reporter ought to indicate why they don't apply. So there's a certain kind of latitude that every entity has. Nonetheless, we think that it's important to emphasize, in particular, something that is missing from the current standards, and that is disclosure on human rights due diligence policies with really solid guidance on what that entails and why it's important. So this is step one of the 6 steps of the OECD due diligence guidance to develop that policy and integrate responsible business conduct into those policies. And what it calls for is specific company-wide commitment to assessing human rights risks throughout the value chain. And that includes a broad scope impact and saliency assessment to identify and prioritize the most significant risks based on meaningful stakeholder engagement. And so it's in that broad commitment to broad scope assessment of impacts that there can be greater assurance that impacts of a particular entity are not overlooked. And we also want to emphasize that something else we see that is not prominent, or really kind of not present to any significant extent in the current standards, and that is the idea that I've already mentioned of meaningful stakeholder engagement. A company cannot know its risks if it doesn't have a means of meaningful outreach to the people impacted by them. And I would add that this is not just to gather information on social risks and opportunities, but equally so for environmental risks and opportunities, since, as mentioned earlier, affected communities and individuals are also impacted by harms to the environment on which they depend. And just to finally to note that Rights Collab has a separate project. We're spearheading a collaboration to create human rights due diligence and environmental due diligence tools for investors to aid them in discerning the quality of human rights and environmental due diligence of companies. And one of those tools is a stakeholder engagement guide, which we believe ISSB can usefully leverage for the standards guidance.
That's really interesting. And I think what I hear from stakeholders is that there is really a need to bridge the gap between this environmental and social silo. So a lot of stakeholders are actually looking for the tools that are going to combine both aspects. And I know that there has been several of them that came out in the last couple of months, but I still think this is really an emerging area of work that we all will be looking at. And with this, let's wrap up for today. It has been a pleasure to have you with us, Joanne. Many thanks for joining the podcast.